No, porque más a largo plazo hay inversión.
Yeah.
Más a largo plazo.
Next, Ekaterina Pirozkova from the South African Reserve Bank.
Good morning. Thank you very much for this opportunity to present this workshop. This is a joint work with Giovanni, Nicola. Sorry? Okay. So this is a joint work with Giovanni, Nicola, and Charles. All of them are in this room. This is the work that focuses on the analysis of the effects of monetary policy announcements in South Africa. And the usual disclaimer applies that views expressed here are not the views of the South African Reserve Bank, ECB, or the Eurosystem. So the high-frequency identification in asset prices has become the leading approach to study the effects of monetary policy and has been used by many authors cited there to decompose the effect of monetary policy announcements, but mostly in advanced economies, US, Euro area, and the UK. So there is a lack of evidence on the effect of monetary policy in emerging economies. And we're trying to fill this gap with this paper by using high-frequency identification of monetary policy effects in South Africa. So South Africa is an interesting case to look at because it has liquid and developed financial markets, is a small open economy with modern central banking. And in this context, we capture the effect of monetary policy announcements with three factors. The first factor being the short-term conventional monetary surprises, and two communication surprises, two medium and long horizons. We study the transmission of monetary policy using the event study approach and in a structural VR with external instruments. So the findings for the effects of monetary policy in South Africa are the following. First, each monetary policy decision comes largely as a surprise for the market. Second, monetary policy surprises appear to correlate with central bank forecasts. And also, they do correlate with the realized global shocks to monetary policy in the US, Euro area, and oil supply shock. So essentially, we get evidence on the information effects of monetary policy or signaling channel of monetary policy in South Africa because market seems to react to the private information disclosed by the South African Reserve Bank at the moment of announcement. And we get evidence on instability of the reaction function on the SARB because we see that market participants are largely unable to anticipate the reaction of the SARB to global shocks. So we find that conventional monetary policy in South Africa works in a standard manner, and shocks at longer horizon are compatible to risk premier shocks. So the monetary policy in South Africa has adopted the inflation targeting framework in 2000 and is a flexible exchange rate regime, so the SARB does not intervene at FX market, characterized by central bank independence, and which is set out in the Constitution, and no use of unconventional monetary policy tools. So there is no forward guidance or the QE policy. So in this context, we make use of the data from market of interest rate derivatives to capture the expectations about monetary policy across maturities. So specifically, we use forward rate agreements and interest rate swaps rates across the maturities from 3 months to 10 years. So specifically, the FRAs capture the monetary policy expectation up to 24 months. The interest rate swaps cover the expectations of policy up to 10 years. And in addition to that, we include the 3 months interbank rate, which is a widely accepted benchmark of short-term rate in South Africa, and is a expected prevailing rate 3 months ahead. We compute high-frequency surprises in daily window around MPC announcement dates over June 2002, January 2020 sample, which is all the inflation targeting period. And to the extent that market participants update their beliefs in response to monetary policy announcements about the current and the future path of monetary policy, our computed market-based surprises capture this beliefs update. And then we follow the methodology of Gürkaynak and co-authors 2005, Antavilla and co-authors 2019 in construction of factors, monetary policy surprises. So to extract monetary policy surprises that allow for economic interpretation, we use the entire maturity structure of our market-based surprises. We extract three latent factors by principal components, and we rotate these factors. So we identify factors that load on short, medium, and long maturities. So in these factor rotations, the restrictions that we impose on the rotation matrix are the following. We impose only the first factor, load on the shortest maturity, 3 months. And among the 2 remaining factors, we impose the third factor to explain the largest share of variation in market surprises at 10-year horizon. We also impose factors to be orthogonal to each other and to have unit length. So as a result, our first factor is a short-term monetary surprise, which is effectively related to surprise change in policy action, whereas the second and the third factor are they capture revision in expectations about policy going forward. So the second factor captures this change in expectation from 6 to 24 months, and the third one covers more the horizon beyond 2 years. And because our second and third factors are orthogonal to the first one, makes them effectively be communication surprises, because they are unrelated to surprise change in the policy. And later in the event study and in the impulse responses, we'll look at what are exactly the effects of these surprises. So, because it has been shown already that high-frequency surprises could combine true policy shocks with the central bank information, we do control for this effect in our factors. So we control for the South African Reserve Bank information set, specifically inflation and output growth forecasts and forecast revisions. And we regress our identified factors on this forecast and forecast revisions. And so as a residual of this regression, we obtain the factors that are robust to presence of the central bank information. So the SARB information appears to play quite an important role in explaining the surprises at medium and long horizons. Their role is quite small for the short monetary surprise, but appears quite large for medium and long horizon. So essentially it means that there is quite a heavy effect of signaling channel when we look at the effect of at factors at longer horizon. We also find the significant effect of external variables such as global uncertainty, oil supply shocks, the US and euro area monetary policy shocks on our identified factors. And essentially, this significant effect means that market is unable to anticipate how the Reserve Bank will react to global shocks. So we are saying that market is uncertain about the reaction function of the bank to global, big global events. And lastly, we look at the correlation of our factors with changes in the policy rate. And we find quite strong correlation of the first factor, the short-term monetary surprise, with changes in the repo rate. And given that our factors are orthogonal to the information set of market participants, it effectively means that there is an element of surprise in each monetary policy announcement that brings the decision, discloses the decision about the repo rate. However, we are quite careful at the moment about this result. We are still looking at the results with the Bloomberg forecasts. But what we see at the moment is this correlation. And when we compare this number with the number for the US and euro area, we see that the surprise component in the announcement in South Africa is quite larger. So in US and euro area, the changes in the policy rate are better anticipated by the market. So assuming that monetary policy does not respond to changes in asset prices within a day, and this is a reasonable assumption to make, the policy can be thought of as having a causal effect. So one can study the response of financial market to monetary policy. And this is what we do in the event study. So specifically, we regress daily surprises in yields, stock market, exchange rates, country risk premium, and capital flow measures on our identified monetary policy factors. And because this is the first and the third factor, the short and the long factors that feature systematic variation, so they have stronger power in explaining policy, I will begin with those. This is in contrast to the second factor that essentially picks up some important big global events. So features less systematic variation. So what we see for the first factor is that the increase in this short monetary surprise shifts the yield curve in such a way that it flattens. So effectively, the effect on the shorter rates is quite large and is smaller on the longer end of the yield curve. And this is very much in line with what was found for the effect of the target factor in advanced economies. So for the stock market, there is a significant negative effect that the surprise increase in the policies, the increase in F1 has. And we also see the currency appreciation effect to increase in F1. And this, again, is very much in line what was shown to the effect of the target factor. So the currency appreciation is consistent with the increased interest rate differential in this case. So overall, our effects for the first factor, the short monetary surprise, is basically very much in line with the effects of the target factor. So the increase in the third factor does rotate the yield curve. So the effect on the long rates is strong, and there is no effect on short rates, which effectively means that communication that changes policy expectations 10 years ahead has a stronger role on the long yields than the surprise change in the policy rate. So this is quite meaningful results in this context, and it basically is consistent with what was found for the path factor for the US before. So we also see the significant increase in the sovereign risk premium measure, which is EMBI plus South Africa index. It's JP Morgan sovereign spread index, a conventional measure of sovereign risk premium. So at a daily window, we see the response of a country risk premium jumping upon the increase in the third factor, the long-term factor. In line with that, we see the reduction in the capital outflow measures. So non-residents, these are the purchases of domestic bonds by non-residents. They fall significantly upon the increase in the third factor. And also we see the reduction in stock market value. So likely because investors see domestic bonds, well, both domestic and non-resident investors see domestic stocks are being more risky, so they reduce their demand for domestic stocks, and the stock market valuation goes down. So what we document here is essentially that the effect of the third factor works via changes in the risk premium. This is an important result from the event study. And with regards to the second factor, it does lift the middle part of the yield curve, but this effect turns out to be the information effect because we don't find the significance when we use the informationally robust factor. Also, second factor has a negative effect on stock market values and devaluates domestic currency. So, and this is in line with the adverse effect of global shocks that essentially this second factor does pick up. So now let's turn to the impulse responses. We estimate VR with the Bayesian methods, use standard prior, and show 90% coverage bands here. So we instrument the monetary policy shock with our monetary policy surprises that are informationally robust. So we normalize the size of the shock to be 1 percentage point increase in the short-term rate, the 3 months interbank rate JIBAR. And what we get here is a strong decline in real activity that we measure here with a coincident indicator that is peak effect of 1 percentage point reduction within 12 months. We also see the strong and persistent reduction in prices following this shock. And for interest rates, the result is consistent with what we found in the event study. So for longer maturity yields, the effect becomes less. So for 1 percentage point increase in 3-month rate, we get a 0.4 percentage point increase in 5-year rate, and only 1 percentage point increase in 10-year yield. We see the reduction in stock market valuation and fall in real house prices. So this basically also lays the ground for the weakness of the balance sheet of both borrowers and lenders, such that a financial accelerator effect kicks in, and we also see the squeeze in the bank loan issuance, so that the credit channel is operative in this case and contributes to the reduction in real activity. And we also see the negative impact effect on trade balance. This is consistent with our finding for the exchange rate appreciation that we have in the event study. We don't see the significant effect on the exchange rate here because we have, most likely because we have monthly values, but at daily frequency we do see appreciation. So this is in line with exports becoming more expensive, and so the volume of export falls, and so trade balance shows this pattern. So overall, the effects and impulse responses to this monetary policy shock are very much consistent with the effects of a conventional monetary policy tightening.
Can I ask about the export thing for a
Yes.
second? Let's see, is that surprising with this dominant currency pricing thing? So the pricing should be in dollars, right? It's
Yes.
in dollars under the dominant
Exactly.
currency. So,
Yes.
So then the change in the exchange rate, you can't change the amount of exports that you do because the prices are in dollars and those rates on. I'm just asking, is that consistent with the dominant currency pricing?
Even more because majority of exports are commodities. Therefore, commodities are all priced in dollars.
Yeah.
Yeah, therefore it's consistent.
It's exactly.
Not less.
Oh,
You asking about the trade balance?
The trade balance, therefore.
on the right, on the right. Oh, wait, oh, sorry, Jesus, I
Yeah.
saw export. So.
No, it's the trade balance, yeah.
The trade balance is going down because exports are going down.
The value of export
The value.
in rand will go down
Oh, okay.
because you have
Yeah.
appreciation.
Got it.
Okay, so conventional monetary policy tightening. For the monetary policy shock that is instrumented with this third factor, so it's effectively shock at long horizon that we normalize to induce the 1 percentage point increase in 10-year yield, the picture looks quite different. So first, we see the sharp significant pickup in the risk premium measure. Again, we see the capital outflows, so the fall on impact of net purchases of South African bonds and stocks by non-residents, likely because non-residents readjust their portfolios to the increased riskiness of domestic assets. We see the depreciation of domestic currency on impact, and again, in line with that, the rand-denominated value of South African export, also the positive reaction on impact, and hence the positive response of trade balance. The stock market falls, and also the credit issuance goes down. So there is this negative significant effect on real activity, which is by size even somewhat larger than the effect of.
Have you looked at whether trade balance movement is guided by exports or imports?
We don't have this data. We only have the trade balance figure available, so we don't know exactly. But because the economy is such that is highly dependent on exports, so export is a high share, so we just assume that this is export variation in the trade balance.
I think it should be available,
No, this is monthly frequency, and this is not, and this is not really available. So here again, consistent with the results of the event study, we see that the effect of this long-term monetary policy surprise is via variation in the risk premium. So we have interpretation of why the surprise communication from the bank could have this effect. And because we know this is not the information channel, so our interpretation is that the bank, the Reserve Bank changes its communication about its monetary policy preferences that might be inconsistent with long-run stability conditions. And therefore, this increase in risk premium kicks in. But this is our interpretation. We're still looking at how we can find exactly why is the case for this, the third factor, to be transmitted this way, and what is exactly this factor. So we use this text analysis methods to analyze the content of monetary policy announcements and to look at what could explain in the text the variation in the third factor.
Yeah, that was my thinking, that the communication that is not necessarily limited to monetary policy issues. Certainly the rise in the risk premium might be more related to what's happening in the fiscal side, but because of the credibility of the SARB, when it comes from the SARB, there's more of a reaction than it would be.
Absolutely, yes, absolutely.
Let me go to the second factor. I won't go in details here, but because essentially this is the shift to the medium horizon, but we see the same effects of a different magnitude. The positive response of the sovereign risk premium upon the increase in the medium yield of 2 years up to 1 percentage point, the capital outflows, currency depreciation, somewhat more persistent response of trade balance, the reduction in stock market values, the squeeze of the bank credit issuance, and also reduction in real activity. So to conclude, we show here that every monetary policy decision comes largely as a surprise for the market. We also show the significant effect of global factors in our monetary surprises. This is possibly due to uncertainty about the reaction function of the bank that has to balance these multiple goals and trade-offs, such as the internal policy objective versus the long-term stability conditions in a volatile environment. And this is this challenging setup that the Reserve Bank is operating in is exactly what we label with the trouble everyday metaphor. by Frank Zappa. So we show that conventional monetary policy has textbook effects, whereas the communication appears to operate via risk premium and has strong implication for macro conditions. So in this context, basically, we see that the Reserve Bank is constrained in this pursuit of internal target by the need to minimize its effect on country risk premium. So let me finish with that. Thank you.
Refet.
So is this a surprise in the sense that it's unexpected, or is it a surprise?
We had the discussion, yeah, we had the discussion after.
Let me answer that. All right. Let me get my slides, though.
You're fine. I'm fine. Let me find it. Should I find it?
Found it.
Okay.
Okay. Very good. All right. Super. I thank the organizers for asking me to discuss this paper. It's a pleasure, actually, to discuss this on many levels. It's very nice, elegant work, nicely delivered, presented, so thank you for that, too. Now, I'm going to complain, because what is the fun in discussing a paper if one doesn't do that? But let me first say that this is nice work, and I really admired the authors on several levels. One of which is this. This emerging markets category is a weird thing in the sense that if you brought in a Martian and asked, show me the landlocked countries, they would do it. If you said, here's data, tell me the poor countries, they would do it. We ask, tell me the emerging markets. It's this weird thing that is probably more in our minds than anywhere else. And we have this understanding of emerging markets as different from advanced economies, because they are not advanced, I guess. But it also comes with a condescending connotation that these are kind of weird economies where rules of economics don't quite apply and the data is crap. So the nice work that we do for the euro areas and the USs of the world, when it comes to Chile, Uruguay, Turkey, South Africa, it's like, yeah, emerging market economics. Right? And that actually is flat out wrong. And this is very nice work that shows how flat out wrong that line of argument is. Right? If you think that high frequency identification is a good way of measuring monetary policy in the US, it's also a very good way of measuring monetary policy anywhere. And it's just the industriousness of the researcher to go out and do this for countries that are worthy of their attention. So these people are really industrious and do it nicely. The other thing that, of course, happens is when you're doing applied work, if you're doing this for anywhere other than the US, it becomes really difficult to publish it. If you're doing this for, again, you would know, right? Uruguay, Turkey, unless you're able to say, ooh, the question is of broad interest, but the data only exists or the experiment only exists here, right? The standard answer is, who cares, right? Well, millions of South Africans care, and it's really important that somebody actually takes a look and says, this is how things work here. So these people do that, and I really admire that. Okay? And they don't shy away from really bringing in the heavy empirical machinery. So, and that relates to the first point, right? They don't do good enough for South Africa. You would do some half-assed work that is applied. Nobody had done this before. So whatever we do is huge value added. So we're going to do the cheapest thing and be done with it. They actually do it the way one would have done it anywhere. So very nice, and I really admired that. Okay, so what is the paper? The presentation was very good, and look, I'd seen the slides before, so I thought the presentation would be good. So this is going to be short. By the way, though, my discussion is based on the slide deck that I've seen for a while, and then a very early draft-ish of a paper. So there are bits that I surely misunderstood and I'm discussing from the wrong angle, and you're going to correct me, okay? But this is daily data, and the paper is slightly apologetic that intraday data doesn't quite exist, so it's daily. But one thing that we know in this literature is that unless you're really trying to understand exchange rates, and that's the one thing that you truly need intraday data for, daily is just good enough, right? It's not biased. The precision is a bit lower, but you end up telling exactly the same story with daily than with intraday. So good, okay? What happens? You get a bunch of yields, and on policy days, these move around, and you say, surely, they have 14, surely we haven't learned 14 different types of things, right? There's an underlying structure here. That's your latency idea. And you ask, how many things are there? Okay? And that's the root of the question, in fact, right? Because when you do principal components on 14 things, you're going to end up with 14 principal components. And your question is, how many of these are statistically actually there? That properly is a rank of a matrix question. We know how to answer this. I'm going to complain that 14 is too many. But before then, just in my words, let me tell you what goes on. Imagine that you find 2. Okay? What you're saying is, really, this is a 2-dimensional space. Okay? And your eigenvectors tell you that these are the vectors that span this space. So you end up with this. Okay? Fine. As an economist, you look at this and say, what the hell are these? And in general, the answer is, don't know. Okay? But luckily, these span the space. That also spans the space. That also, as long as you keep the orthogonality, right? Any 2 spans the space. And some of those 2 have economic meaning. And that's the rotation that you do. So they do a nice one here. Okay? In the presentation, these were factor 1, factor 2, factor 3. I dislike that. I think when you're doing monetary economics, you should never do this, because when your policymaker asks you, at the end of the policy day, why did the stock prices go up so much? The answer should never be, because factor 3 was large, right? And you don't usually keep your employment long with that answer, right? You really have to have an answer. And in the paper, you name these things. More or less, these are the target, the action of the central bank, path, the forward guidance surprise, and the risk premium surprise, okay? Good, fine. I'm going to complain about that too, though. Okay, so then you take these surprise factors, these are daily surprises, right? And then you ask, how do other asset prices react to these things? Those were the event studies that we saw, right? You then fear that perhaps what I see as a monetary policy surprise isn't a deviation from the central bank's rule, it's revelation of some other information. I'm not a big fan of this idea, but there is one reasonable way of doing this properly, and that's Giovanni and Silvia's way. Now, the entire information effects literature, other than this one paper, hinges on looking at various asset price reactions, right? Nakamura-Steinson would be long end of the yield curve did this. So we're going to call this information effect, right? Yorodzinsky-Karady is stock prices did that. That's information. Andrade and Ferrero is inflation swaps did this, right? Sang and I have some work where we look at the exchange rates and say, yeah, right? But these are all wrong in the following sense. If you're asking, is the high frequency thing that I extracted a good instrument, okay? And fearing that maybe it isn't because it's contaminated with information, it's not good enough just to look at the market reaction. The market reaction is the information the market participants perhaps attribute to the central bank, right? So I cut interest rates, you observe a surprise cut in the interest rates looking at the short rate, but stock prices go up. You say, okay, that's information. No, that's right, right? Stock prices also go down. You say, this is information. Fine, okay? It may be, and that's clearly, in that interpretation, information I attribute to the central bank. But this by itself does not invalidate the instrument. That requires the central bank to actually have the damn information and be reacting to something down the road, right? It's only Giovanni and Silvia's work that asks, here is what I see from the event study on the day where markets seem to be attributing information to the central bank. And here is the information set of the central bank. Let me look at the union, right? It's the regression of that information-ish thing on the central bank's information set, usually in the US, the Green Book, here, the central bank's internal forecasts, right? It's the fit of that that actually creates the problem, okay? So they're doing this the right way. Fine, okay? Then, run your VAR, do the proxy VAR. We saw the results of that too. And then also ask, okay, how do these surprises relate to external factors? Right, the uncertainty, the Fed surprise before this, the ECB surprise, the oil prices, okay? So that's the paper. Nice, okay. Now, we saw that there are 14 yields in the matrix from which we extract the monetary policy factors. 14 is too many. And in particular, these come in 3 groups. One is the 3-month interbank rate. That's the term rate. A bunch are forward rate agreements, and a bunch are swaps, okay? The moment you tell me that I'm going to have 3 different kinds of things in my matrix, I can tell you that you're going to end up with at least 3 factors, because financial markets are segmented, okay? So you're always going to end up with factors that say swaps co-move between themselves, forward rate agreements co-move between themselves, right? The derivatives and the term rates are kind of different. Those appear to be factors in that matrix, but they're not factors in your monetary policy sense. They're really fluke factors. And there's a footnote in the paper that says, statistically we see 5 factors here. Of course you will, because when you have a boatload of stuff, you will end up with boatload of factors, okay? Now, some of this says cut back on the number of things you put in there, okay? You don't really need 14 things in there, okay? The other one says if you do your number of factor statistical test, end up with 5, and then decide to use 3 of these, have some argument about why 3. In particular, why not 2? Why? Because here, right, when you think of the Swanson way, the European application of this, the 3 factors are the policy action, forward guidance, and quantitative easing, okay? And that's a natural 3-factor monetary policy interpretation that we are familiar with. However, this cannot be the case in South Africa because there is no QE. So when you extract 3 things, how am I to think about the 3rd thing as a monetary policy induced factor rather than, junk in the data set? That, I think, is an important question. Now, what I would like to see is, this is called a scree plot, right? Just the size of the eigenvalues, and be told that, if I just use 2, I would only get to 60% of the variance. When I put the 3rd, I got to 85%. That's really important. My thinking is that wouldn't be the case, that 2 would get you to 85 by themselves already, and the 3rd really isn't there, okay? But it's important to see what those factor contributions are and what they look like before you do the rotation and after you do the rotation, right? The other thing that's really useful to do, especially about that 3rd factor, is to do a falsification test. Forget that these are monetary policy dates. Do the same thing, say, for the day before monetary policy or just any other non-policy date. But do the same rotation. And my thinking is you're going to find that 3rd factor again, because it's just level moving the yield curve around. It's there on policy days and non-policy days. And it's really important to convince first yourselves, then your readers, that what you are capturing is something induced by monetary policy. This is different from whether it's information effects or not. But it's really through monetary policy that financial markets are reacting, because these things are all over the place all the time. Okay. The other thing then is, this is something that was not in the slides but in the paper, is then asking, okay, so you do your factor extraction and rotation, and you actually have the factors. So this day, F2 was huge, right? And natural thing to ask is, what the hell was happening on that day, okay? These are wrong answers. Because this one says, on this day, F2 was huge. What was happening? Lehman Brothers filed for bankruptcy. Now, Lehman Brothers filing for bankruptcy cannot be a reason for a surprise on a policy date in South Africa. In fact, Lehman Brothers had filed for bankruptcy in September 2008, okay? Similarly, uncertainty about US policy normalization. This had been going on for months by this point, okay? Similarly, minister fired. It was fired in December 2015. How do I know? I read the paper, it's there, okay? Now, unless the South African public is so incredibly ignorant about the rest of the world, but are very attentive to monetary policy, so that they wait until the policy announcement to understand, Lehman failed, okay? Again, this is not whether it's information or not. It's just that things that have happened, a zillion days ago cannot show up as surprises. I'm not disagreeing with this. The surprise is there. I'm disagreeing with that. This cannot be the reason of that surprise, okay? Now, the other thing is, now that you have this F3, my least favorite factor, you call it risk premium, which I agree with. Chislak and Shrimp and others also, doing this kind of work refer to it as risk premium. One ought to ask, what the hell is a risk premium induced by monetary policy? Okay, it cannot be the pure policy surprise, because really what it is it's movement of the long end of the yield curve, right? Okay, why would the long end of the yield curve move? Reason one, I learned something about my central bank, and in fact, that's here. Okay, this is genuine monetary policy. And this is an information effect, right? It's not that I learned the central bank is jacking up interest rates, and yeah, it happens. I didn't see that coming, but fine. That's pure policy. I saw that and concluded that, this is actually a serious central bank. I learned something about the reaction function of the central bank. That's an information effect, okay? And that's the only kind of reasonable information effect for me. Fine. But that's information, moving the long end around. What else? Risk premium. Risk premium, kind of half-assed way of thinking about risk premium, but not entirely incorrect, is it's the quantity of risk times the price of risk. If that premium is moving around, one or the other or both have to be moving around. Now, the central bank by itself is not going to change the quantity of risk going forward, because you're looking at 10 years. It can only tell you that the world is actually riskier than you gave it credit for, okay? That's an information effect. That's the quantity of risk. Or it's the price of risk. What determines the price of risk? It's the curvature of the utility function. Right? For people in my epistemic community, macrofinance dudes, that curvature and the pricing kernel associated with it are also relatable to the current state of the economy. That's most of the macrofinance literature for you, right? But if the central bank is moving this, it's moving this because it told you something about the current state. That also is an information effect. In fact, in our standard and indeed a large set of non-standard models, there are no pure monetary policy surprises that can move the long end of the yield curve, because all those models have monetary neutrality in the long run. And you're identifying this factor through the non-neutrality, so it can't be monetary policy. Then it will have to be information. In your analysis, you attribute a third of this factor to information, but then the other 2/3 will have to be pure policy. It really cannot, right? So, there, okay? Similarly to, why these spikes cannot really be Lehman failing, it's very difficult to make sense of the case where you have oil prices affecting or being correlated with the surprise in South Africa. Fed surprises that had happened last month being correlated with surprises in South Africa today, okay? That requires either, again, South Africans not paying attention to the Fed policy at all, right? And then learning about it through the Reserve Bank of South Africa's policy action, very unlikely, okay? Or these regressions have 20, 30 observations, so perhaps it's just a fluke. Or it will have to be an interesting kind of information effect where Reserve Bank of South Africa is actually paying attention and responding to ECB policy, Fed policy, oil prices. But we don't quite understand what exactly the reaction function with regard to those arguments are. And so what you're finding is us learning about the reaction function, okay? But that's something worth developing and thinking about, right? This one, you showed us your impulse responses of the proxy VAR. You have 3 instruments, right? Factors 1 through 3, which relate to the current stance of policy, something like the medium run 2 years or so forward guidance, and then the 10-year out non-QE stuff. Okay. In the VAR, you have the 3-month rate, 2-year rate, and the 10-year rate. It's not very clear, neither from the slide deck nor in the paper, is clear what the instruments are. It's not very clear what is being instrumented. There are 2 ways of doing this. One is to say, I have a favorite policy indicator, and here naturally it would be the 2-year, right? Because it's moving all of those things. And you can take that 2-year point and instrument it with factor 1, factor 2, factor 3, trace the effects, and those would be very comparable. Okay? Or you can say, I'm going to take the first factor, instrument a 3-month rate with that. I'm going to take the second factor, instrument a 2-year rate with that. Okay? That's also a legitimate exercise, but those are conceptually different things and conceptual different understandings of what the policy indicator is, how the VAR is supposed to work. And clarity on that is very useful. Okay? Hence, this is great. And I think this is the kind of emerging markets research that we should be doing. The economics is really interesting. The econometrics is really interesting. Okay? It's clear that this paper is at a good state to be presented and receive feedback, but it has some time to be further developed. So I guess I am the lucky soul who saw the paper, but you should all be waiting to see the working paper circulating, and I do recommend that when it's to come, take a look at it. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
You wanted to?
You want me? Yeah.
No, yes. Huh? Do you want to say?
You want me to say something? Yeah.
How does it work? Should we get more comments?
Are you going to smack me now that I'm right next to you?
No, I actually, maybe only no, it's sort of just thank you. I really thank you very much for really great comments that push us really forward. Only one thing about this issue of the table, because it was not presented and it was not presented for a reason, because I think we had a discussion about this, therefore, exactly for that, no? Because in some sense, okay, we have these shocks, we see when they happen, and we read the text, we try, and then with the work we want to add on top of this, really to try scientifically to read the text to see why there is this correlation, what happened after this event was interpreted. For example, and the naming are wrong in some sense, in the sense that, for example, in this particular case, you had the Lehman Brothers, so therefore everybody was expecting things to go badly. In the text, you don't find any discussion about that. They're only discussing about the inflationary pressure inside, and therefore they don't react. And therefore, we are looking to find text in the market, try to find from the Bloomberg News how they were interacting. Therefore, we try really to answer the question looking really at the sort of the text. The only way I can, and this is also for the minister, and Nene fired, was fired, and everybody was expecting what is going the central bank do, because the political pressure was to lose monetary policy. They responded with increasing monetary policy, and therefore you can interpret, as you said, is an information about the credibility, the long-term credibility. No? Therefore, that is how do we interpret. That's why we call it risk premium, but I totally, and therefore, but I think we need for this one really and also to call it risk premium, you're absolutely right, because it can only be in the communication part, and therefore we need to find more in the communication part, this channel, this chain, therefore that is absolutely, and the issue of the factor, I'll let those that actually extracted the factor to discuss it. But definitely there is because in some sense we were guided by the mapping of what was done for let's say, therefore, but it's clear that they respond to a very clear policy framework. The policy framework is that, therefore, the names are given to you by what the different policy tools are. Here, in some sense, is a discovery, try to find in which way monetary policy operate at all these different levels. And for example, it's true that, and your thing about the three instruments is very interesting. It's true, for example, the F2 is a difficult, it's difficult to know what it is because we don't have QE, etc. Therefore, definitely, I mean, technically, definitely there is a great issue. But I'll let the others.
No, I think we have only 7 minutes, so let's grab some questions and then.
Okay.
Yeah, so super interesting. So it seems like you can predict the surprises with publicly available information. So it really points to this uncertainty about the reaction function. Then I was wondering what the literature is in South Africa on an estimated policy function for the central bank. And is there a lot of instability in that you're talking about that's changed a lot? Because that would be kind of tying it together. There's a nicely stable, well-accepted monetary policy actually function in South Africa, then you have to think about what's
Rutira, you can say something about that. Anybody? Yes, go ahead.
I was wondering, if you look at the overreaction literature, the deep one type of overreaction, there is some premise to say that the overreaction in the market can take some time to resolve itself. And so if I'm not sure, in the South African case, then it does take some time, and coincidentally, then there is that period where there's how would you account for that? It's a sense that you may be accounting for what the bank is doing. If it's in the period, especially with the bank and issue, which took basically almost a couple of months to resolve itself in the market. And the information that was there was a bit contradictory in a lot of senses, that there's a fundamental panic in the market, but then during that period there is that monetary policy action that takes through. And so I'm a bit confused sometimes to say, but is this reaction to the monetary policy issue, finding its foundation on what market participants believe about credibility of SARB, or is there something else that's going on there? Recently, we did some work on hedging in the ZAR stock market. That it seemed that in periods of market extremes, you could correlate the monetary policy action with the hedging behavior. And I'm thinking maybe there is some justification in those periods of crisis to why you are picking up some of the things that you're picking up.
Giovanni.
Yeah, so I'll try also to answer a couple of things. So first of all, thanks a lot for a fantastic discussion, and really our apologies for sending you a draft that was not even a paper, but a bunch of notes. So that really shows that you are a friend. The second, on the points, and there are lots of good points, and I agree with most of them. But let me just address a couple of them. First of all, why 3 factors? You point to the right problem there, and in fact, when we try and look at the effects, the macro effects of the residual 2 factors, essentially there were none, as far as I remember. So in a way, we selected the macro relevant, but you point to probably a better way to go and to define numbers of factors. Perhaps we have to drop some of the assets we have there. On the big question, can the central bank change risk? Now, when we think about advanced economy, usually the answer should be no. But then you think about the euro area, and there's whatever it takes moment, and that changes risk premium massively. In a country that is an emerging country, it's an open economy that has is very exposed to external shocks. Our understanding, and here probably is where this discussion is useful, is that the central bank communication can change the perception of the risk in terms of the quantity itself. And if you think of that, In terms of the communication credibility, in terms of potentially large policy mistakes, in terms of what are perceived as changes to the rule, all of them would affect the long end of the yield curve, albeit in potentially different ways. And it's here where we are essentially at work and trying to understand. And that very precarious map between a narrative of events and surprises was trying to map essentially how market might have perceived the reaction of central banks to these events, and therefore how they were mapping the response of the central bank to the credit yields and the primary condition on those events into risk going forward. But there's much work to be done, and I agree. And more in general, it's a question of the instability of the interpretation of the policy rule, because clearly this is an inflation targeting a country, but has to juggle with many policy objectives, including internal stability, where you can have a situation flaring up quite quickly. So the central bank is overly exposed, is the most credible probably actor at the moment, and therefore has potentially different objectives, and markets have to interpret that. Finally, on what is being proxied, so these are used as external instruments. They're not, we don't instrument the yield first, and then we insert it into the VR. But we normalize, as you were pointing out correctly, onto the short end, the 1 year and the 5 year, if I remember correctly, but then I can correct me. So in a way, the normalization is on that, and it's true that then we cannot directly compare. But we could do a variance composition on that condition, assuming these are invertible shocks. On a mid-question, I don't know, that probably has more.
Sorry, which question? Because I couldn't
On
hear.
whether there's a limitation in South Africa on the stability of the policy function.
Stability.
The question is that you need an instrument here to do it properly, and we have now an instrument, so perhaps we could go and look at that question. Or reaction, good suggestion, I don't know how to respond to that.
Yeah, just people estimated Taylor type rules
Yeah.
for South Africa.
I'm not actually aware of.
But there is, I mean, Rutira here has done a lot of work on this. There is and you can confirm, I mean, there is not a lot of, it's quite stable, actually. But, for example, it's quite non-linear in the reaction, therefore it's not, it tend to, there was all the work on the non-linear reaction factor, you tend to wait at the border. There has been a bit of change in communication, therefore was, before was 3.6, therefore the expectation converges to 6, then now they are emphasizing more the 4.5, therefore there is a change in, quite significant change in the way you present the inflation targeting, yes.
And is it correct that you guys have expectations data, like market expectations?
Yeah.
Of that output and inflation?
Yes.
So one thing you could do is run estimate and market perceived Taylor rule on the expectation data, and that might help you figure out, because the key here is what does the market think of the central bank's reaction function?
Yeah.
Right? And if you have survey forecasts, you could actually estimate that and see. Because that's kind of the key thing, like the story is all about so much uncertainty about the reaction function that you get these big surprises even after things that you should have.
That's very good.
But I'm not sure that the market expectations data goes so far as to say the market participates specifically in that. And that's not
I don't know, actually.
generally, I think it's a general survey on inflation expectations, not necessarily.
No. But the market expectation will have expectation. If I look at the Bloomberg terminal, you have the expectation of the market participant on the GDP, on the inflation, and on the policy rate. Therefore, this is what we know, to use data, to use the expectation of the policy rate on their expectation of output and inflation, so that you can see what the expected policy rule was relative to what actually. Yeah, it's a great idea. Yeah, that's a great idea. And
I think we're over time, so we should.
okay, it was great. Thank you very much. Thank you.